welcome to Simpler Bible, a daily journey to biblical understanding. We're back in Esther. We have left off about 8 years into our story, and we have left off with Haman deciding he wants to kill all the Jews. It was, for our purposes, January 13th, and they're going to kill everybody December 13th, right? So the 13th day of the first month, they're going to kill everybody on the 13th day of the 12th month. When Mordecai learned that this had been done, this is verse 1 of chapter 4 of Esther. When Mordecai learned that this had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the midst of the city, and he cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went up to the entrance of the king's gates, for no one was allowed to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. And in every province, wherever the king's command and his decree reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting. And many of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. Remember, sackcloth was garments that were worn to show mourning and grief. When Esther's young women and her eunuchs came and told her the queen was deeply distressed, she sent garments to clothe Mordecai that he would take off his sackcloth, but he wouldn't accept them. Then Esther called for Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, who had been appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what this was about and why. Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him all that had happened to him and the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay the king's treasuries for the destruction of all the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of all the written decrees issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her, and command her to go to the king and beg his favor and plead with him on behalf of her people. Now remember, twice already it's mentioned that she has not revealed to the king who her people were or where she had come from. And this is on purpose, and it was for this time. God orchestrated it wisely for this time. But now Mordecai wants her to go and beg the king to deliver her people, which means she's going to have to reveal who she is. And Hathach went and told Esther that Mordecai had said. Esther spoke to Hathach and commanded him to go to Mordecai and say, all the king's servants and all the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is only one law. Now remember, the law of the Mercians and the Peds. The Persians and the Medes cannot be undone even by the king. So she says, here's the law. If you go and stand before the king and he didn't ask you to come there, here's the law: to be put to death. That's it. You're going to be put to death. There's one exception to that. The one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter in his hand, that person may live. But as for me, I haven't been called to come to the king for 30 days. And they told Mordecai what Esther had said, and Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think yourself that in the king's palace you will escape more than the rest of the Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, another source. But you and your father's house will perish, and who knows whether you will not have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. So Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go and gather the Jews to be found in Susa, hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days or 3 nights. And I and my young women will also fast as you do, and then I will go to the king, though it's against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Mordecai went away and did everything Esther ordered him to do. On the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court in the king's palace. Now remember, the law is to be killed unless the king holds out his golden scepter to her. And so she stood in the king's palace in front of the king's quarters while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room opposite the entrance. When the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight, and he held out his hand. He held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter, and the king said to her, what is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It will be given to you, even to half my kingdom. How does he know that she has a request? Because he hasn't seen her in 30 days. He hasn't asked for her to come into his presence for 30 days. And she boldly comes in violation of the law. And so he's like, what is it you want? I know that you want something. Whatever it is you want, up to half my kingdom, it's yours. Esther said, if it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to a feast that I have prepared for you. And the king said, bring Haman quickly so that we can do what Esther has asked. So the king and Haman came to the feast that Esther had prepared. This is so smart of her, just so much wisdom. And as they were drinking wine at the feast, the king said to Esther, what's your wish? It will be granted to you. What's your request? Up to half of my kingdom, it's yours. Esther said, here's my wish. Here's my request. If I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my wish and to fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the feast that I will prepare for them, and then I will tell you what I would like. Haman went out that day, joyful and glad of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he neither rose nor trembled before him, he was filled with wrath against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself in the moment and went home, and he sent and brought his friends and his wife Zeresh. And Haman recounted to them the splendor of all of his riches, the number of his sons, all the promotions with which the king had honored him, and how he had advanced him above all the officials and the servants of the king. And Haman said, "Even Queen Esther, let no one but me and the king come to a feast she prepared. And tomorrow I'm invited together again with the king. Yet none of this is worth anything to me as long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting there at the king's gate." Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, "Let a gallows be built 50 cubits high. Let a gallows be built 75 feet high," or a pole is what other translations will say, 75 feet tall. So to impale Mordecai on. "Let a gallows be built 75 feet tall, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged upon it, and then go joyfully to the feast with the king." This idea pleased Haman, and he had the gallows built. Esther chapter 6. On that night, the king couldn't sleep. Man, the sovereignty of God, the beauty of God, listen to this. On that night, the king couldn't sleep, and he gave orders to bring the books of memorable deeds, the chronicles, and they were read to the king. So he can't sleep, and he's like, "Hey, read a good book to me." And so they're reading these books to him, and they're recounting to him different things that have happened in his kingdom. And it was found written how Mordecai had told about Bigtha and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, who had guarded the threshold, who sought to kill the king. We read about that yesterday. And the king said, "What honor or distinction was bestowed upon Mordecai for this?" And the young man who attended him said, "Nothing was done for him, Your Honor." Your Honor, sorry, I don't know where that came from. Random. That's how I read it in my head. It's just there in the back of my brain waiting. The king said, "Who's in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows that he had prepared for him. And the king's young men, so keep this in mind, the king is in his bedroom, hadn't been able to sleep all night. And he's like, how do we honor Mordecai? And then Haman is coming in to ask the king. Haman's the second most important person in the land. And he's coming in to ask the king, "Hey, let's kill Mordecai." And these two hearts for Mordecai are about to collide. And the king is like, "Who do we have in the court? Who's here that I can talk to?" And so the king's men said, "Haman's in the court. He's here to speak to you." And he goes, "Well, let him come in." So Haman came in, and the king said, "What should be done to the man the king delights to honor?" So Haman comes in, and before Haman can get out his words, "I want to kill Mordecai," the king says, "Hey, Haman, what should I do for the man the king wants to honor?" And Haman, in his pride and his arrogance, says, "There's no one the king wants to honor more than me." So here's how Haman answers. Haman said to the king, "First of all, for the man whom the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought which the king has worn, and a horse which the king has ridden, on whose head the royal crown is set. And let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most trusted officials. Let them dress the man that the king wants to honor. Let them lead him on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming, 'This is how it shall be done for the man the king wants to honor.'" Now remember, Haman thinks he's about to receive this honor. And the king said to Haman, "Hurry, take the robes, take the horse, as you have said, and do this to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned." Now, it is interesting. He says, "Do this for Mordecai the Jew." He already knows that he's signed into an edict, the death of all the Jews. But he says, "We need to honor this Mordecai guy. Haman, you're just the guy to do it." So Haman, who wants to kill Mordecai, is forced then to take the robes and the horse, dress Mordecai, and lead Mordecai on this horse through the city, saying, "This is how the king honors those he delights in." Mordecai returned back to the king's gate, but Haman hurried back to his house, weeping and mourning with his head covered. Haman told his wife Zeresh and his friends everything that had happened to him that morning. And listen to what his wife says. And his wife and the wise men said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but you will fall before him." While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and told Haman it was time for the feast that Esther had prepared. And so he's going back for day 2 for this feast with Esther and the king, and he's already been humiliated in front of the people and by parading around a Jew that he wants to put to death. And so tomorrow, part 3, the end of Esther. Join us then. It's a great story, and I look forward to sharing the rest with you next time. Thank you so much for journeying with us today at Simpler Bible through another section of Scripture where we come to know and understand God a little bit better. Look, if you're brand new to Simpler Bible, we have all sorts of resources available for you. Go to our website, simplerbible.com, and there you can find these videos, you can find our podcast, you can find links to our social media, and you can even find a blog post with additional scriptures if you want to go into a little bit more study than we had time to cover in this podcast and video today. We hope that this tool will be exactly that for you, a tool. Not something that replaces your daily walk with God, but something that enhances your daily walk with God and helps you to know and enjoy Him more. Thank you so much for being part of this, and we'll see you again tomorrow.